Hi, today we're going to be looking at Component 3, Section A of the Edexcel English Literature A-Level. This unit is on contemporary poetry or otherwise known as poems of the decade. All of the poems that are studied are within the book that is linked on the slide. However, I would suggest that as you don't actually need the whole book, you may just want to print out the copies and you can then annotate in a more easy way. It's entirely up to you. If I teach you, I will have given you a booklet, but again, as I say, you are feel free to buy the text. Also linked on the slide is a revision guide with the ISBN number there. I would strongly suggest getting that because some of these poems, while interesting, can be a little tricky to get your head around, so I would suggest buying the text there. So this session is all about just making sure we understand the unit, what we need to do for this paper, and potentially introducing us to the depth of analysis that we may need. So exam information then. This is the third paper of the English A-Level, and this section in particular is Section A. So the whole paper, Section A and Section B, is timed at 2 hours and 15 minutes. If you get extra time, you can work how much extra you get on top of that. This entire paper is 30% of your overall grade. And as I say, the paper is divided into two. Section A is contemporary poetry, and Section B, my class do Rossetti, but you may do another topic of your teacher's choice. In both sections, there will be two questions as a choice. You can pick question 1 or question 2. Both marked with the same marks, and there's no difference. It's just your preference. For Section A in particular, you will get asked to compare a named poem, and I've put all the poems that we study on the right-hand side there, with an unseen poem that it is extremely unlikely you will have come across. Or if you have, you must be really into your poetry. I've never come across some of the poems that have come in the exam so far. Some I have, some I haven't. So you'll compare one of the named poems that you will have studied with an unseen poem that you will never have seen in your life. Odds on. And the question will ask you to compare the methods the writers use to present a theme or an idea, and I'll go through that in more depth in a moment. So here is an example of how it will be laid out on the question paper. So again, question 1 or question 2. And it will be, Section A, post-2000 specified poetry. Read the poem on page 2 of the source booklet before answering one question. Write your answer in the space provided below. Now, in the exam, you will be given, obviously, the unseen poem, because otherwise you will still never have seen it. And you will also be given a copy or, the book of the seen poem as well. So as I say, you are not going in blind. You will have a copy of both poems in front of you. It's entirely up to you which one you select. So for example, in this choice of questions, the unseen poem was Somewhat Unravelled by Joe Shapcott, and that, like in both questions, that is the unseen poem that is used. However, the named poem, the one you will have already studied in question 1, is I'm rereading On Her Blindness by Adam Thorpe, and they're comparing the methods about how poets explore the effects of growing old. Or in question 2, they have to reread Please Hold by Kieran O'Driscoll, and then they're comparing how the poets express strong emotions. So obviously comparing is considering the similarities and differences between the two poems. I mean, it goes without saying. But the methods is the one that some students do get a little confused by. By methods, the question is asking you to consider the language choices, the structural choices, and any other techniques used by the poet to give that theme or that idea across. So for example, in Please Hold, one of the methods that the poet uses to show strong emotions is the structure of it, and it's all very linear and very short and aggressive, and there's a lot of repetition in there to show his deepening frustration at the futility of his argument. So you would comment on that. and then Somewhat Unravelled, the unseen poem, it may have something similar in that, or it may be something completely different. It doesn't matter as long as you are showing that you understand that whatever method is used to show, in this case, strong emotions or growing old. Here is the mark scheme for you. I'm not going to read the whole thing because you can read, I would hope, if you're doing English literature. But just to give you kind of an overview, you are marked for the assessment objectives AO1, AO2 and AO4. What you'll notice there is you are not marked for context. Now you are going to question that on some of the poems, and some of the poems I would argue you need to have a relative understanding of some contextual factors to be able to understand the poem. The one that comes to mind is the poem History, which is related to 9/11. But if you don't know about 9/11, the entire poem becomes very, very confusing and just baffling. So while you're not marked on context for some, I am going to give you or provide you some context just to kind of help your understanding. But as I say, you are not marked on that. You are marked, as I say, on AO1, so you must have an articulate, informed and personal and creative response. They don't ask for much, do they? And you must be using associated concepts and terminology, and of course, you must be writing in a coherent and accurate written expression. So they don't want you to write slang, they don't want you to write with no full stops and capital letters, etc. They want you to write in an educated, analytical way. AO2 is your analysis, and it is exploring the way that meanings are shaped. So how is, I don't know, as I said in the other slide, how are strong emotions shown? How does X equal Y? You've kind of got to demonstrate that for AO2. And obviously, as you go up the mark scheme, if you're looking at band 4 and band 5, the way, your critical evaluation of that. So are they successful in doing that? Are they discriminating in their ideas? Again, it's up to you. And then AO4 is clued into the question, really. It's the comparison. Are you comparing the poems enough? Are you comparing them, or are you just doing it as you may do in the section B of this paper, where you actually aren't marked on your comparison at all? So that kind of idea. So they want you to really be evaluating the comparison. Is one poet more successful than the other? Is one doing it one way and one doing it the other? But they're both equally as delightful. It's entirely up to you, but you have to be demonstrating your understanding. Slide 5. How to be successful in this entire unit. Obviously, you need to be able to understand and use poetic language, structure and form. I don't want to be reading about how poets use paragraphs. They don't use paragraphs, they use stanzas and so on. You have to be using that correct terminology. You must understand the taught material, because obviously you going in having an unseen poem, you kind of at least need to have a good grasp of the seen poems to be able to help yourself out. You have to have the ability to analyse unseen poems, which, again, you'd hope you'd be able to do by the end of this unit, and I'm sure your teachers will give you practice for that. And lastly, you have to be able to identify connections between the texts. Now, I always argue that the question is giving you a huge clue with that. If the question is about growing old, odds on, both poems are going to be about the idea of aging or something along those lines. So use the context clues around to kind of help you as you do your analysis. So I'm going to just briefly go through some terminology. I have no doubt that you will probably know a lot of these. However, I'd rather be safe than sorry, and I imagine you do too. So poetic form, which you must know for all of the seen poems and hopefully the unseen poem as well when you get into the exam, just means what type of poem it is. Does it conform to a specific set of rules? So for example, a sonnet, you should know, has 14 lines and so on, and there are different types of rules depending on the different sonnet. You would need to know that, and if it differs from that, so for example, if it's a truncated sonnet, if it's actually only 13 lines, what does that mean, for example? In the exam, it may not be clear if the unseen poem conforms to any particular set of rules, but there are some that are easy to spot, and I'll go through those in a second. And if the poem doesn't have a specific form that you recognise, think about the impact of the structure anyway. So think about the way the lines are written out, think about the way the stanzas are laid out, etc. So the most obvious type of poetic form I've kind of listed here for you. I haven't included, oh no, I have included sonnets here, so never mind. So firstly, in general, poems fall into two camps. They're either open or they're closed. Closed form poetry is poetry that follows a very specific set of rules and expectations. So they're very rigid in how they're laid out. So for example, a sonnet is 14 lines, usually iambic pentameter, so think about the rhythm of the lines. There is usually a volta, where there's a change in tone or a change in idea or, some kind of change. And they're typically on the theme of love. Now, there are different types of sonnets, as I mentioned. So there's Shakespearean sonnets, Petrarchan sonnets, Spenserian sonnets. You would potentially need to know which one was which, but if you can just spot the sonnet, that should be enough. A villanelle. Now, a villanelle is a poetic form with 19 lines and a very strict pattern of repetition and a rhyme scheme. Each villanelle has 5 tercets, and a tercet is a 3-line stanza, followed by 1 quatrain, a stanza with 4 lines. They originated from Italy and Spain during the Renaissance period and were typically put to music due to their song-like rhythm created by the strict rhyme scheme. So in the set poems that we study, Genetics is an example of a villanelle. And when you read that poem and when I explain that poem, you'll see why that is very, very rigid in the way that's set out. Next, an ode. Now, an ode is a form of lyrical poetry in which poets use a certain metrical pattern and rhyme scheme to express their noble and lofty sentiments in serious and sometimes satirical tone. Since the theme of odes are inspiring and lofty, they have a universal appeal. Also, by using the sublime and exceptional style, poets endeavour to compose grand and elevated types of odes. Think of these as the poems where it's just, I don't know how to word it any better, but just very fancy. Just very fancy, very ode to a, the example that we get given, or we kind of are meant to compare with, is Ode on a Grecian Urn, and that was written by Keats. And it is a very fancy poem all about how beautiful this vase is, and what this vase represents, and so on. And it's just a very fancy kind of poem. Now, the ones we study, Ode on a Grecian Periurn, is a satirical version of, like, it's almost mocking in kind of a way, Keats's poem, and about the idea of how he uses the ode form to satirise Keats's. Again, when we study that poem, that will make more sense to you, but just remember that an ode is a very fancy, admiring poem. Open form poetry is just very free. It doesn't have to follow any traditional patterns. It may not even follow any rules at all. It might take, a little smidge of a poem here and a little smidge of a form of a poem over there. But in general, they kind of just do their own thing. But then you'd have to consider why it was so free and so open. So free verse poetry. Free verse is a literary device that can be defined as poetry that is free from limitations of regular rhythm or meter and does not rhyme with fixed forms. However, it still allows poets to use things like alliteration and rhyme and cadences and rhythms to get an effect that is suitable for their piece, but in general the rules are very free. There isn't, as rigid as the odes and the villanelles and the sonnets. Then you've got to consider the poetic structure. So how is it laid on the page? Number of stanzas, lines, breaks in the lines and stanzas. And that is not to say that in your exam I want you to write things like, there are 5 stanzas and there are 3 lines in each stanza. Isn't that interesting? Because, I'm sure your examiner can count to 5, maybe even 15. They don't care about that. They want to know the purpose of that, the utilisation. Why is that being utilised? If it isn't relevant, don't write it. But don't write basic. You're writing, an elevated kind of analysis. So questions to ask yourself when you consider structure is, how might the way the poem appears on the page link to its meaning and effect? and you have to be able to link to that purpose and the intention of the writer. So I've given some terminology here. I'll just kind of go through this again. I have no doubt you know most of this, but as I say, I want to be safer rather than sorry. So firstly, stanza is the separate components or the separate parts of a poem. Silly little geese may call them paragraphs of a poem. You will not. You will call them stanzas because they are not paragraphs. A rhyme scheme is, identifying the pattern of a rhyme, beginning with A, B, for example, or A, B, C, D. It could be any rhyme scheme. Rhyme, repetition of the same sound. Rhyming couplet, where there are words that rhyme that kind of next to each other, they're a couple. Half rhyme, where words slightly rhyme or they sound kind of similar, they're not a full rhyme. Repetition, where something is repeated. Syntactic parallelism, the repetition of a sentence structure. So, for example, I came, I saw, I conquered. It's the kind of same sentence type. Same sentence type, same structure. Triadic list, listing of 3 adjectives or nouns. And rhythm is the beat of the poem. Enjambment is where a line continues onto the next line without a pause. And again, you'll see a lot of that in the poem studied. Anaphora is the repetition of the start of a line in a poem. A refrain is when something is repeated throughout a poem, but then it doesn't occur. It refrains. Think like a lot of popular pop songs have refrains in them. A caesura is a short, definite pause used for impact. So think full stops, think commas, think semicolons, and why they might be used. Hyperphora is a question followed by an immediate answer. I always think of the Sonnet 43 that my school do at GCSE. How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. So it's an immediate answer to that question. Iambic pentameter is a 10-syllabled line, so where it's unstressed and then stressed. So we stress the words we want the world to hear. Iambic pentameter is meant to replicate how we speak naturally. And if you say a normal sentence, you will note you emphasize every other syllable. Unless you really think about it, and then it's a bit crazy. End stop line is a line in poetry ending in a full stop for dramatic effect. An internal rhyme is rhyme used in the same sentence or line. Then we've got to language and devices and the power of individual words or phrases and the overall effect of the language of the poem. So things like similes and metaphors, alliteration, personification, and so on. And again, you need to consider if a simile is used, why is it used, what is its effect. Again, I've given you some terminology and some examples, and I hope you know them, but if not, I will go through them. So a simile is describing something using like or as. So for example, the spotlight was as bright as the sun. A metaphor is describing something as if it is literally something else. So the spotlight was the sun. An extended metaphor is the continuation of a metaphorical image or symbol throughout a whole text or throughout a big chunk of the text, not just one kind of sentence. Personification, giving an inanimate object human characteristics. For example, the door stared at me. A semantic field is a group of words that create a similar idea or theme. So, for example, grave, blood, cemetery would give a semantic field of death. Connotations are associations of the word. For example, a snake has negative connotations of being sly and devious. Onomatopoeia, when a word sounds like that sound, for example, bang, crash, boom. Dysphormism is a figure of speech that is defined as the use of disparaging or offensive expressions instead of inoffensive ones. And a euphemism refers to polite indirect expressions that replace words and phrases considered harsh and impolite. So, for example, a euphemism for someone, I don't know, someone died at war would be, oh, someone has fallen. A soldier has fallen. Like, everyone knows what that means, but it's said in a kind of nicer way. Whereas dysphormism is where you have something that's, neutral, and then you make it really bad. Types of alliteration or phonological devices. We've got alliteration. So where words in close proximity begin with the same letter. So the big bellowing badger. Assonance is the repetition of a vowel sound, and vowels are obviously A, E, I, O, U. So for example, go slow over the road, that O sound is kind of repeated. Consonance, the repetition of a consonant sound. It hurt when it burnt, the T sound is consonant there. Sibilance, the repetition of an S sound, so she sells seashells by the seashore. Congratulations to me for being able to say that, well done. Plosive sounds, repetition of the B, P, D, K, G and T sounds, because they're typically harsh. And I always try and remember that as plosive. It's quite a harsh sounding word. Fricative, a repetition of an F, a V, a Th or TH sound. Quite softer sounds, quite calming. It depends on the context of the sentence, but usually more calm. Nasal sound, the use of M, N or sounds. Again, depends on the context of when they're used, but sometimes calming, sometimes not. Bilabial plosive, specific for the B sound. So it's a specific type of plosive sound, is B. A cacophony is the term refers to the use of words with sharp, harsh, hissing and melodious sounds, primarily those of consonants. So if you have a cacophony of noise, it's just, imagine walking into an orchestra and every band member plays a random note. So it makes no sense, it sounds awful, it sounds loud, unmelodious, etc. And that's kind of what cacophony is. Euphony can be defined as words and phrases that are distinguished as having a wide range of noteworthy melody or loveliness in the sounds they create. It gives pleasing and soothing effects to the ear due to repeated vowels and smooth consonants. So again, if we use the orchestra example, and you walk in and you've got all the nice little harps and all the nice little, I don't know, flutes, all playing the same note, that would sound quite lovely compared to a cacophony of noise where they all sound awful together. And then finally, synesthesia is a figurative use of words that intends to draw out a response from readers by stimulating multiple senses. So it might be talking about noise and visual, or it might be talking about smell and taste and sight as well. It might be using a range of senses to interest you. An example here is that you can do in your own time is this poem here. It's by Carol Ann Duffy. It's called Text. And what I would suggest is you have a look at the poem and you have a go at analysing it. Now, this would be an unseen poem. This is not one of the ones we study. But try and consider, like, if you had that teeny tiny poem, what would it be about? What kind of shape of the poem is it? Is it organised structure? Is it disorganised structure? If so, why? In your first reading, what does the title mean? Does it suggest the theme or story? What's your initial response to it? What's your big picture? And then slowly go down into the details of, what's happening in the poem? What kind of devices are present? Who's the speaker? What's the tone? What type of imagery is used? And if you can do that, that is good practice for what you're going to have to do in the real exam. Here I've given you a range of questions that you might want to consider when looking at that poem by Carol Ann Duffy. And then here what I've done is I've kind of annotated that poem for you to give you the idea of the kind of things that you could be talking about. Now, as you'll see, obviously I haven't covered everything, there just isn't enough room, but I have covered a lot. The depth of analysis, even for an unseen poem, has to be high, and that's what I think students find the most challenging and the most scary for the paper. So you are going to have to do a lot of practice of unseen poems to try and understand what you need to do.